My name is Jacob and I'm 34 now, but I've been carrying the weight of my childhood for as long as I can remember. Growing up, it was painfully obvious that my parents had a favorite, and it wasn't me. My younger sister, Sophia, now 30, was their golden child from the day she was born. Meanwhile, I felt like I was just there, like an afterthought in my own family. It started when I was young. Too young to understand what was happening but old enough to feel it. I was 7 when Sophia turned 3, and they threw her the kind of birthday party that kids dream of. They hired entertainers, rented rides, and bought her a massive 3-tiered cake. I remember sitting there, watching everyone make such a fuss over her, wondering why my birthdays were never like that. That same year, for my birthday, they got a plain supermarket cake and called it a day. We didn't even go out. It was just dinner at home. That became the pattern of our lives. Sophia got the best of everything and I got the leftovers. The favoritism didn't stop at birthdays. Sophia always had the newest toys, the nicest clothes, and the best gifts at Christmas. When it came to school events, my parents never missed anything of hers. Every recital, science fair, or parent-teacher meeting, they were always front and center, cheering her on like she was the next big thing. But for me, it felt like I had to beg for them to even acknowledge my accomplishments. Once I had a lead role in a school play. I was so excited, practicing my lines every day, and I couldn't wait for them to see me on stage. But the night of the performance, they didn't show up. Sophia had complained of a headache, so they stayed home. I found out later that she was feeling fine less than an hour after they decided not to come. I stood on that stage, searching the crowd for their faces, but they weren't there. There were countless moments like that, moments where their priorities were crystal clear. If Sophia wanted something, it didn't matter what plans were already in place or who else might be affected. She always came first. I started to internalize it. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need their approval. But deep down, it hurt. It hurt to feel invisible in your own family, like no matter what you do, you'll never be good enough to matter to the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. Looking back, I wonder if there was something I did to deserve it, or if they just decided that Sophia was worth more than me. I've replayed so many memories in my head, trying to figure out where it all went wrong. But no matter how hard I think about it, I can't find an answer. All I know is that the unfairness of it shaped who I am today, for better or worse. When I was in school, I threw myself into my studies. It was one of the few things I felt I had control over, one of the few ways I could prove to myself that I was capable of something. I wasn't just a good student, I was one of the best. I spent hours studying, preparing for exams, and diving into extracurricular activities that challenged me. One year, I worked tirelessly on a project for a statewide science competition. I poured every ounce of effort into it, staying up late, fine-tuning every detail. When I won, I was so proud of myself, not just for the award, but for all the work that went into earning it. But when I came home with my certificate, eager to share the news, my parents barely looked up. My dad muttered, "That's nice," while my mom said something about dinner being ready soon. That was it. No congratulations. No acknowledgement of what I'd accomplished. Meanwhile, Sophia, who was barely scraping by with passing grades, could do the bare minimum and be showered with praise. I remember one instance vividly. Sophia had managed to pass a math test with a satisfactory score. Nothing stellar, just enough to not fail. My parents acted like she'd just solved world hunger. They bought her a brand new smartphone as a reward. I was floored. Couldn't believe it. Here I was, excelling in every subject, achieving things that genuinely mattered, and they couldn't even muster a well done for me. But Sophia, she got treated like a hero for doing the absolute least. It wasn't just about grades or school either. The double standard ran through every part of our lives. When I was invited to participate in a prestigious summer program at Princeton, it felt like a dream come true. I was 16, and this was an opportunity that could shape my future. I nervously told my parents about the invitation, hoping that maybe this time they'd be proud. My dad's response? Well, don't be arrogant. That was it. No excitement, no encouragement. Just a thinly veiled criticism, as though being good at something was a flaw. When it came time for me to leave for the program, I asked them to take me to the airport. It was a simple request, something any parent would do for their child. But they refused. Sophia had a school concert that day, nothing special, just a regular performance with the choir. "You can find another way," my mom said dismissively. I ended up taking a cab, feeling humiliated and hurt. It wasn't just the inconvenience. It was the message they sent by prioritizing a routine school event over one of the biggest moments of my life. The thing is, Sophia didn't even care about school concerts. She hated performing and had complained nonstop about having to go. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that she wanted their attention, and she got it. Every single time. Looking back, I think that summer program was a turning point for me. It was the first time I felt like I could truly escape the shadow of my family, even if just for a few weeks. Being surrounded by people who recognized my efforts and valued what I brought to the table was eye-opening. It was a glimpse of what life could be like outside the suffocating dynamic at home. Still, even that didn't erase the bitterness. No matter how far I went or how much I achieved, a part of me always carried the sting of knowing that, to my parents, I'd never be enough. A few months ago, my grandfather passed away. I hadn't been particularly close to him in the last few years. Mostly because my parents always kept me at arm's length from extended family, but I'd always admired him. He was the kind of man who had built a life from the ground up, instilling in me the values of hard work and perseverance, even when my parents didn't. After the funeral, I didn't expect anything to come from the will. I assumed my parents would handle it all and Sophia would be the center of whatever attention or generosity was to be given. Then came the bombshell. It turned out that my grandfather had left an inheritance to all his grandchildren, an equal share of his estate. My portion? Nearly $800,000. I was stunned. It was more money than I could have ever dreamed of having at one time, and it felt like a lifeline. Between my student loans and the financial challenges I'd faced trying to carve out my independence, this money could completely change my life. I started imagining the possibilities. Paying off my debts, investing in something meaningful, maybe even starting a business or putting a down payment on a house. For the first time in a long time, I felt like things were turning in my favor. Of course, that feeling didn't last long. My parents found out about the inheritance almost immediately. They weren't exactly happy for me. Instead, they went straight to work, telling me what I should do with the money. Specifically, they insisted that I give it to Sophia because, as they put it, she needs it more. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Sophia was still living at home with them, working part-time at some retail job she barely showed up to, and they wanted me to hand over my future so she could continue to coast through life without lifting a finger. "You're doing fine, Jacob," my mom said. "You've got a stable job and you've always been independent. But Sophia, she's struggling. She needs help." "She's not struggling," I shot back. "She's just lazy. She's 30 years old and refuses to grow up." "That's not my responsibility." My dad chimed in then, his tone stern and dismissive. "This family sticks together. You don't turn your back on your sister." Felt like a slap in the face. All those years of being overlooked and undervalued, and now they wanted me to give up the one thing that could finally give me some stability because Sophia needed it. She had never worked hard for anything in her life, and here they were, ready to hand her nearly $1 million of my inheritance, just because she didn't feel like putting in the effort to stand on her own. Sophia, of course, leaned into the whole act. She cried about how hard life was, how unfair it had been to her, and how she just needed a break to get back on her feet. It was infuriating to watch, knowing she had been coddled and catered to her entire life while I had been left to fend for myself. "Jacob, don't be selfish," she said at one point, tears streaming down her face. "You don't understand what it's like to feel stuck like this." I wanted to scream. The sheer audacity of her trying to guilt me into giving her what I'd rightfully earned through no small amount of struggle and patience was almost too much to handle. I could see right through her crocodile tears, but my parents, as always, ate it up. The pressure was relentless. Every conversation with my parents turned into a lecture about family loyalty and how I was being cold-hearted. My mom even went as far as to say, "What would Grandpa think of you, knowing you're putting money above family?" I nearly laughed at that one. If anything, I think Grandpa left me that money because he knew how my parents were. Maybe he wanted me to finally have a chance to live my life on my terms, without them constantly dragging me down or prioritizing Sophia over me. For weeks, they badgered me. Every phone call, every visit, every family dinner, it was all about the money. Sophia, meanwhile, played the victim, acting like I was personally ruining her life by not handing over what was mine. At one point, my mom even threatened to cut ties with me if I didn't do the right thing. I didn't give in, but the whole ordeal left a sour taste in my mouth. What should have been a moment of joy and relief turned into yet another battle to prove that I mattered, that my needs and dreams were just as important as Sophia's constant demands. And for the first time, I started seriously questioning whether staying connected to my family was worth the emotional toll they seemed determined to take on me. It didn't take long for my parents to escalate their attempts to pressure me into giving up the inheritance. At first, it was all guilt trips and emotional manipulation, but when that didn't work, my dad decided to take a different approach. One evening, he called me over to their house, saying he needed to discuss something important. I knew where this was headed, but I went anyway, thinking maybe this time they'd finally back off. Instead, I walked into a setup. My dad sat at the dining table with a stack of papers in front of him, Sophia sitting nearby, dabbing her eyes with a tissue like she was starring in a soap opera. My mom hovered in the background, her face a mix of determination and disappointment. My dad got straight to the point. "Jacob, I've been thinking a lot about your grandfather's wishes," he began, with a self-righteous tone that made my stomach turn. "As one of the executors of the will, I feel it's my responsibility to do what's morally right. Your grandfather would have wanted Sophia to have your share of the inheritance because of her situation." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Her situation? You mean the one she created for herself by refusing to grow up and take responsibility for her own life? "Don't be disrespectful," my dad snapped, his voice suddenly sharp. "This isn't about blame. It's about doing what's fair. You're doing fine, Jacob. You've always been independent, and you've never needed much help. But Sophia has had everything handed to her her entire life." I interrupted, my voice rising. "Don't stand there and act like this is about fairness. Grandpa wanted us all to have an equal share. That's what he decided. You don't get to rewrite his wishes just because you feel like it." My dad's expression hardened. "As the executor, I have the authority to make these decisions. I'm going to transfer your inheritance to Sophia. It's the right thing to do." I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. This wasn't just favoritism anymore. This was outright theft. "You can't do that," I said firmly. "The will is clear. Grandpa wanted the inheritance divided equally among all his grandchildren. You don't get to change that." It was then that my mom jumped in, her voice dripping with condescension. "Jacob, we raised you better than this. Money isn't everything. Family comes first." "That's funny," I shot back, "because it seems like family only comes first when it benefits Sophia." The tension in the room was suffocating. Sophia sniffled dramatically, still playing the victim, while my dad looked at me like I was some kind of ungrateful monster. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my coat and stormed out, slamming the door behind me. The next day, I got a call from my grandmother, my grandfather's widow. She was sharp as a tack, even in her old age, and had always been more supportive of me than my parents ever were. When I told her what my dad was trying to do, she was furious. "That's absolutely not what your grandfather wanted," she said firmly. "He was very clear about the inheritance being divided equally. He didn't believe in playing favorites, and he knew how your parents treated you. That's why he made sure the will was ironclad." She then told me something that made my jaw drop. In the will, there was a specific clause stating that any attempt to alter or manipulate the terms of the inheritance would result in the guilty party forfeiting their share. She even had the documents to prove it. "Your father doesn't have the authority to do what he's claiming," she explained. "And if he tries, he'll lose his own inheritance. Let him know that if he pushes this, he'll be the one left with nothing." I felt a surge of relief and gratitude toward my grandmother. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had someone in my corner. Armed with this information, I confronted my parents. When I told my dad about the clause in the will, his face turned pale. He tried to bluster his way out of it, claiming he had misunderstood the terms, but I could see the panic in his eyes. My mom tried to spin it as a miscommunication, saying they were only trying to help Sophia out. You weren't trying to help Sophia, I said coldly. You were trying to steal from me, and if you push this any further, you're going to lose everything. So I suggest you drop it. They backed off after that, though the resentment in their eyes was impossible to miss. Sophia, of course, acted like I was the villain in all of this, crying about how I was punishing her for things that weren't her fault. But I didn't care anymore. For once in my life, I stood up for myself and didn't let them steamroll me. The experience left me more disillusioned with my family than ever. It was clear that they would never see me as anything other than a resource for Sophia to exploit. But at least now, I had the means to start building a life on my terms, free from their manipulative grasp. When I confronted my parents after learning the truth about the will, I was prepared for resistance, but the level of vitriol they threw at me was still shocking. My father started immediately, accusing me of being selfish, greedy, and heartless. This is about family, he barked, slamming his fist on the table. You're choosing money over your own sister. What kind of person does that make you? I'd heard this refrain before, but now it felt even more calculated, as if he thought guilt alone could break me down. My mom was no better. She sat there with her arms crossed, her face a mask of anger, declaring loudly that I had destroyed the family by refusing to bend to their demands. I hope you're happy, Jacob, she said, her voice dripping with bitterness. You've ruined everything. We've always done our best for you, and this is how you repay us. That line almost made me laugh. Their best had always been reserved for Sophia, while I got the scraps. But they weren't done yet. My dad, in a final attempt to intimidate me, threw out a threat. If you keep this up, I'll exclude you from my will entirely, he said, leaning forward as though daring me to challenge him. I looked him in the eye and said, Go ahead. I don't need your money, and I definitely don't need your approval. It was the truth. After years of feeling trapped in their web of manipulation, I realized this inheritance wasn't just financial freedom, it was emotional freedom. For the first time, I wasn't scared of their threats. What I didn't expect was how quickly my grandmother took action after I told her what had happened. She was furious, and when my grandmother got angry, she didn't just sit back and fume. She did something about it. She contacted her lawyers immediately, explaining the situation in detail, and made sure my parents knew that their actions would not go unchecked. My grandmother wasn't the only one outraged. Word of the situation spread through the family like wildfire. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in years started reaching out, expressing their disbelief at my parents' behavior. Some of them had apparently suspected for a long time that my parents played favorites, but this was the first time they'd seen it so blatantly. One of my uncles, who had always been close to my grandfather, was especially livid. Your father has no right to mess with the will, he said. Your grandfather trusted him to honor his wishes, and this is how he repays that trust? Unbelievable. With pressure mounting from every direction, things came to a head quickly. The lawyers, with my grandmother's backing, moved to have my father removed as one of the executors of the will. It was a process, but in the end they succeeded. He was officially stripped of any authority over the inheritance. When I found out, I felt a mix of relief and vindication. All their scheming and manipulation had backfired spectacularly. My inheritance was finally secured, and there was nothing they could do to take it away from me. My parents didn't take the news well, of course. My dad stopped speaking to me altogether, and my mom doubled down on the guilt trips, sending long, dramatic texts about how I'd betrayed the family and driven a wedge between everyone. Sophia, predictably, played the victim, acting as though I'd stolen something from her rather than simply refusing to hand over what was rightfully mine. But for all their dramatics, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. For the first time, I wasn't caving under their pressure or letting their opinions dictate my choices. I had people in my corner who saw the truth, who supported me, and who made sure justice was served. It wasn't an easy road, and it didn't magically fix the years of resentment and hurt I carried. But standing up for myself, with the support of my grandmother and the rest of the family, gave me a sense of strength I'd never felt before. This time, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't the overlooked child or the one who didn't matter. I was finally someone who could take control of his own life, no matter what anyone else thought. For a while, Sophia stayed out of the mess entirely, which wasn't surprising. She had always let our parents fight her battles for her. But as the dust settled, I noticed a shift in her. At first, it was subtle, a quietness that felt uncharacteristic, like she was actually reflecting on everything that had happened. Then one day, she reached out to me. "Can we talk?" she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. I agreed, though I wasn't sure what to expect. Honestly, I braced myself for more manipulation or an attempt to guilt me. But when we sat down, she surprised me. "I've been thinking a lot," she began, looking genuinely uncomfortable. "About everything. About how our parents always treated us differently." I didn't say anything, letting her speak. "I used to think it was normal," she admitted, fidgeting with her hands, "that it was just how families worked. But I see now, it wasn't fair. To you or to me." That last part caught me off guard. "What do you mean, to you?" I asked, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. She sighed. "I know I was the favorite. They gave me everything and expected nothing. And at the time, it felt great. But now, I realized they didn't do me any favors. They never pushed me to be better or to figure out what I actually want in life. They just made me dependent on them. And it's not who I want to be anymore." Hearing her say that was like a punch to the gut. I'd spent years resenting her for the way our parents doted on her. But now she was acknowledging that their favoritism had harmed us both, albeit in very different ways. We ended up talking for hours, having one of the most honest conversations we'd ever had. She apologized not just for the recent drama with the inheritance, but for all the ways she had leaned into our parents' favoritism over the years. She admitted that she used to feel guilty about it, but didn't know how to change anything without upsetting the status quo. For the first time, I felt like I was really seeing her, not as the spoiled golden child, but as a person who had been shaped by the same dysfunctional family dynamic that had hurt me so deeply. The biggest shock came a few weeks later when Sophia told me she was planning to use her share of the inheritance to go back to school. "I want to do something meaningful," she said. "I don't want to waste this opportunity." Her decision floored me, and it clearly didn't sit well with our parents. They'd always expected her to stay close, to remain dependent on them, and to live the life they'd carved out for her. But for once, Sophia was making a choice that was entirely her own. "I know it's late," she told me, "but I want to figure out who I am outside of them. I want to build something for myself." Her determination inspired me more than I expected. I found myself wanting to support her in any way I could, not because I felt obligated, but because I genuinely wanted to see her succeed. We started talking more regularly, checking in on each other's progress, and building a relationship that had never really existed before. It wasn't an overnight transformation, and there were still moments of awkwardness and tension. But for the first time, I felt like we were on equal footing, like we were both trying to move forward and leave behind the toxicity of our parents' favoritism. Her decision to change her life made me reflect on my own journey. I'd spent so much of my life feeling like I was fighting for scraps of attention and validation, but now I realized I didn't need any of that from our parents. I had built something for myself despite all the odds, and I finally felt free to focus on the future rather than the past. Sophia's growth and willingness to own up to her part in everything didn't erase the hurt of our childhood, but it helped. It gave me hope that people really can change, and that even the most fractured relationships can be repaired with time and effort. In the end, I realized the inheritance wasn't just money. It was a chance for both of us to rewrite our stories. And for the first time, it felt like we were finally on the same page, ready to move forward together. With the inheritance finally secured, I was able to do something I'd only dreamed of before: start over. The first thing I did was pay off my student loans. That burden had weighed on me for years, constantly reminding me of the sacrifices I'd made to carve out my independence. Watching that balance hit zero was an indescribable feeling, like finally being able to breathe freely for the first time. Next, I invested in a small business I'd been quietly working on for years, something I'd always been passionate about, but never had the financial stability to pursue fully. With careful planning and a lot of hard work, it started to grow, giving me not just financial freedom but a sense of purpose. For the first time, I wasn't living paycheck to paycheck or constantly worrying about what might go wrong. I finally had control over my life, and it felt incredible. But even with my newfound stability, the scars from my past weren't so easily erased. The years of favoritism, neglect, and constant struggle had left their mark, and I realized I couldn't just push it all down and pretend it didn't matter. So I went back to therapy, a step I'd put off for far too long. Therapy helped me confront the long-term stress and trauma I'd carried with me since childhood. It wasn't easy. There were sessions where I felt like I was peeling back layers of pain I didn't even realize were there. But as hard as it was, it also felt like I was finally letting go of the weight I'd been carrying for so long. One of the most challenging parts of this new phase in my life was figuring out what to do about my relationship with my parents. Things with my mom started to shift, albeit slowly. She surprised me one day by admitting that she'd started therapy herself. "I want to understand," she told me during one of our strained conversations. "I don't want to lose you." It wasn't a full reconciliation, and there were still moments where her old patterns of behavior slipped through. But knowing she was trying, truly trying, meant something. It gave me hope that maybe, over time, we could rebuild at least part of our relationship. My father, on the other hand, remained as stubborn as ever. He refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing, let alone apologize for the years of neglect or his blatant attempt to manipulate the inheritance. He wouldn't even speak to me, and any attempts I made to reach out were met with silence or outright dismissal. At first, his refusal to communicate felt like a fresh wound. As much as I told myself I didn't need their approval anymore, a part of me still hoped he might change, that he might see me as more than just a convenient afterthought. But as time passed, I began to accept that some things were out of my control. I couldn't force him to change or to see things differently. All I could do was focus on myself and the life I was building. Despite the lingering tension with my parents, I found myself more optimistic about the future than I had been in years. Sophia and I continued to grow closer, and watching her take charge of her life inspired me in ways I didn't expect. She was finally breaking free from the mold our parents had forced her into, and it made me proud to see her thrive on her own terms. I also started to think about how my own experiences could help others. The struggles I'd faced growing up in a dysfunctional family had shaped me in profound ways, and I realized that I wanted to use those experiences to make a difference. For the first time, I seriously considered a career in family therapy. It felt like the right path, not just for myself, but for the countless others who might be dealing with similar pain and confusion. This new phase of my life isn't perfect. There are still challenges, still moments where the past feels too close for comfort. But I'm learning to focus on what I can control, to find strength in the progress I've made, and to build a future that feels truly mine. If nothing else, this journey has taught me that healing is possible, even in the face of deep wounds. It's not always easy, and it's never quick, but it's worth it. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be.